Hello, everybody, and welcome to Socratic Med's sixth week of our 15-week MCAT supplement course. My name's Chris, and today I'm going to be teaching the lecture on social behavior of humans. So we're just going to talk about humans, how we socialize as groups. We'll touch a little bit upon how other animals socialize, really quickly on game theory. So there's going to be a lot in this lecture, so I'm just going to try to go really quickly through it. Just make sure that when you're watching it, obviously you go at your own pace. That's the great thing about watching videos when you study is you can pause them, you can play them back slower, play them back more quickly. So just always go at your own pace when you're watching these videos. Socratic Med, just an introduction. If you don't know, we are a grassroots nonprofit, and we provide sensible solutions to students with disparate medical school opportunities. So all of the materials that we supply are free. And you can access those materials through any of the links that I put below. I put our Instagram handle, we have our YouTube page, our website we're currently overhauling, and we're going to make it really, really accessible, really a really great resource. If you want to be added to the GroupMe as well, you can shoot me an email. You can use that link directly to join it. That's really the way that we keep in touch with our students. And then we also have office hours. So we have 30-minute office hours weekly with a couple of our tutors. So if you want to sign up for those individual tutoring sessions, you can click that link tree over there. And there are also a couple of other links on that link tree as well. And on a little bit more of a personal note, my name's Chris, like I said before. I graduated from Stony Brook in May of 2019. And I completed a pre-med track with a Bachelor of Science in Applied Math and Statistics. So I took the MCAT in April of 2021, about 2 years after I graduated, and I scored a 520, which was that test's 97th percentile. So I got a perfect score on the psych and soc section. And those two plus biology are my tutoring specialties. So if you have any questions about that, if you ever have any questions about anything I go over in the lecture, any comments, anything, you can always feel free to email me or feel free to use that link tree and sign up for that Calendly link. Okay, so let's dive right in. So we're going to start with socialization and identity. So we'll start with personal versus social identity. So this lecture, I'm just going to go over, there are going to be a lot of bold-faced terms, so just make sure that you know all of them for the MCAT. There are a lot of just straight definitions in this, and those are really, really the most important things that you understand for these sections. So an individual's self-identity is the sum of that individual's knowledge and understanding of themselves, I should say. So self-identity is how we see ourselves. It's not in the context, well, it's in a couple of different contexts. So self-identity is how we understand ourselves, how we use our experiences to create our perception of ourselves. So personal identity, self-identity is split up into a couple of different facets. So personal identity is made up of an individual's sense of personal traits like attributes. So if someone is smart, funny, someone's loud, maybe they're friendly, personal identity is just basically the traits that make up who you are as an individual. So it's not something that we're going to talk about in a minute, like social identity, where it's in the context of others. We're just looking at ourselves. We're only looking at our characteristics, our behaviors, our tendencies, as opposed to social identity, which is made up of an individual's sense of their social self. So how we categorize ourselves into society, for example. So our race would be part of our social identity, our occupation, our age, gender, because these all tie us to different social groups. Even different subcultures, for example. So if you're part of a motorcycle gang, that would be part of your social identity as well, because it's your identity in context of others in a social setting. So the looking glass self, American sociologist Charles Cooley, who is pictured over here to the left, came up with the concept of the looking glass self. So that is the idea that a person's identity develops from interpersonal interactions with and perception of others in society. So he basically said that from a very young age until we die, there's this concept called looking glass self. So basically we set up our own identities based on our interactions with other people. So based on how we perceive others' actions and based on how we think others perceive our own actions. So like I just said, an individual will shape their self-identity based on the understanding of how others perceive them. So it's almost like we're monitoring our own reputation. So we're looking at how others perceive us, and then we fix our behavior based on how we perceive we are being perceived. So this looking glass self starts at a very early age. So pretty much as soon as you're old enough to understand, as soon as you have a social identity, this looking glass self conceptualizes and we start working on it. And it never ceases until death. So we continue to modify our identity based on our interactions with others throughout our entire lives. Because your interactions when you're in your early 20s are going to be very different than your interactions, say, when you're in your mid or late 50s. And people change throughout their lives. Okay, socialization's effect on identity formation. So the process by which people learn to be proficient and functional members of society is known as socialization. And that's not just people, it's all animals. Any social animal, from birth, they undergo socialization. And it allows for cultural transmission to the next generation. So it's basically taking like a blank slate, say a baby, if we're talking about humans, we're just putting them in a social context, and socialization is the process by which they learn all those cultural elements of their society. They learn how to, act and contribute to society. And that's what socialization is. And like I said, it happens for all social animals. So deprivation studies have shown the importance of early socialization in both humans and non-human animals. And one of the more infamous studies I'm sure you've heard of at this point, if you've ever taken a psychology class, is Harlow's monkeys, which is a pretty unethical study in which it demonstrated the inability of grown monkeys to reintegrate socially, after being extremely socially deprived as babies. So Harlow basically just took these baby monkeys and took away all of the resources and the things that baby monkeys really need to grow up socially, apt. So a lot of these monkeys, they were touch deprived, they were socially deprived when they were babies, and they grew up and they were socially inept, and they were inept in a couple of other aspects of their life when they reached adulthood. And similarly, feral children is the term used to describe children who are not raised with human contact. There are many documented cases, most of which involve social or communicative deficits in adulthood. Feral children is really interesting to read about. I actually did a little bit of reading about it when I was creating this slide. There are many documented cases of children being raised by animals, being raised by primates, wolves, livestock. So it's really interesting just to see how that affects the development, and just to see, these reported cases, how those children did as adults. Some of them did not suffer any social deficits, and then of course some of them did. But there are a lot of confirmed cases, and it's really interesting. If that's something that interests you, I would definitely recommend you give it a read. Okay, so norms. Norms are spoken or unspoken rules that govern an individual's behavior in a society. So in Northeastern America, for example, you probably should not go to the beach nude unless it's specifically designated for that purpose. So, if you think about, you go to certain cultures in Europe where it's a little bit more acceptable to go nude to a beach. Northeastern America, we're a little bit more uptight about stuff like that. There are laws and regulations in place to prevent stuff like this happening. So that's basically what norms are. They're just rules that govern the behavior in a society. So if you break a norm, there are varying levels of punishments that you may or may not receive, either formal or informal, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's just basically when you break a norm, someone looks at you weird. So norms are just these rules that we follow that keep us in line with the rest of our society. Things that seem normal to us, hence the name. So norms are reinforced by sanctions, and sanctions are rewards or punishment for certain behaviors. And again, depending on how important the norm is to social cohesion, affects how strong the sanction is. So a norm that is more important for social cohesion are going to have stronger sanctions. So for example, if you kill someone, that's violating a norm. That's actually violating a formal norm, as we're going to talk about. Formal norms are norms that are written or recorded, such as laws, and those usually carry really strict penalties, because we just can't have a society of people going around killing each other without any consequences. So if you're in a society and you commit murder, those sanctions are going to be very steep. You're going to do prison time for a majority of your life. Whereas, if we have these informal norms, which are those that are generally understood by individuals, but breaking them may not incur a severe punishment. So like I said, if you greet a stranger in the US with a hug rather than a handshake, you could create an awkward situation, but you probably won't be arrested. So in most places in the United States, the norm when you're meeting someone or when you're becoming acquainted with someone is to greet them with a handshake, for example. So if you overextend that, depending on the person that you're talking to, they might give you a weird look or they might make a comment, and it might make you feel a little bit weird. So that's also considered a sanction. It's not prison time, but it's considered a sanction because it's a punishment for a strange behavior. You're breaking that informal norm, so the sanction is going to punish you for that. Okay, so take a minute, review this question, read it. I would pause the video. I'll wait about 5 seconds and then I'm going to go over the answer. So take a look right now. Take no more than a minute, like 1 to 2 minutes. Okay, so let's go over it. A man in the waiting room of a private doctor's office erupts into a tantrum after he's told his appointment will be delayed 10 minutes. He becomes so angry that he throws his cell phone across the waiting room and refuses to leave. Other patients in the waiting room stare at him with disapproving to outraged expressions, and the office manager calls the police to have the man removed. Later that day, the man is informed that he has been discharged from that practice. Which of the following would not be considered a sanction imposed on the disgruntled patient? So the answer to that is D, the man's urge to throw his cell phone. So if we go through each individual answer, disapproving looks from bystanders is considered a sanction. Remember, it's not a super severe form of sanction, but it is a punishment. It's a social punishment, the disapproving looks. B, the manager calling the police is also a sanction. That's a little bit more strict of a sanction, probably because the disgruntled patient threw his cell phone. He was being, irate and to the point where he's being dangerous to others. So the manager called the police, he'll be removed and he may possibly even be arrested. So that would also be considered a sanction. And that's for breaking a formal norm. He's sort of breaking the law by acting aggressively like that in the public forum. C, the discharge of this patient from the practice, that would also be considered a sanction because that is a direct result of his behavior in the office. So he broke that norm, and the sanction, the punishment is that he's being discharged from the practice. So the only one that's not considered a sanction is going to be D, the man's urge to throw his cell phone. That's not a sanction, that's actually the actual action that was performed that would warrant those sanctions. So definitely make sure you know the difference between those two. If you have any questions, like I said, shoot me an email. Okay. So theories of deviance is what we're going over next. And I really like this picture actually, because it basically extremely accurately demonstrates what deviance is. Because when we think about deviance, we often think with a negative connotation, like crooks or criminals, thieves. And often when we are talking about deviance, that is what we're talking about, but not completely 100%. So basically deviance is just separation from the normal, and that's nothing more, nothing less. And let's get into it. So deviance is non-normative behavior. Non-normative behavior, is considered incorrect by a society because it threatens the social structure and social cohesion. So basically that's what we've been talking about right now. We have these norms in place to keep that social structure in order. It benefits everybody. So when non-normative behavior is evident, we use these sanctions and we try to correct it. So actions that violate the dominant social norms are known as deviance. So the concept of deviance has a lot of social implications, and there have been a lot of studies. There have been a lot of, prominent sociologists that study deviance, especially relating to criminology. It has a really big influence on, how we view criminology. So the concept of deviance has a lot of social implications. Creating the deviant label affirms and enforces social norms by setting up a dichotomy between the two. So by creating a deviant label, we're basically separating deviant from normative behavior. So by creating a bad category, quote unquote, we are also creating a good category. So it's it's a dichotomy between the two different behaviors that we want to set up very clearly for each member of society. So that's why we have sanctions as well, to clearly outline what behavior is acceptable and what behavior is not acceptable. So the deviant behavior can be punished and discouraged by both formal and informal means, like we spoke about before. Informal means, if you do something weird in public, you're going to get disapproving looks from bystanders. Formal means, if you break a law, you're going to get arrested, you're going to get fined, you may be even thrown in jail. So remember that deviance, like taboo, is a social construct, and that goes back to what I was just talking about over here. In Western culture, and usually in most concept, and most spheres, when we're talking about deviance, we're talking about criminology, but it's not always the case. So someone deviant in another society may not be considered deviant in this society because it's a social structure, it's a construct. It just means that they are deviating from the norm, and that specific society has deemed that that deviant behavior is dangerous to social cohesion. But something that's deviant in one culture may not be deviant in another culture. Food, for example, eating certain foods in America may be considered deviant, but if you go to other parts of the world, it's just part of the norm. It's just normative behavior. Okay, so a little bit about differential association, and that is the theory that is proposed by Edwin Sutherland, pictured right here to the right, and it argues that deviance is a learned behavior resulting from an individual's interactions with their peers and environment. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the theories of deviance. So an individual will learn from their immediate social environment the techniques, motives, and values of deviant behavior. When an individual is part of a group, either formal or informal, so formal could be pretty much anything, a political party, anything that's on the books. Informal can be like a street gang, a group of friends. So when they're part of a group that condones deviant behavior, it's easier for the individual to learn this behavior. And that, again, happens in both formal and informal groups. So it's basically what Sutherland is saying. The basis of this theory is just the learned behavior resulting from an individual's interactions with their peers and environment. So it's basically saying that we're learning this deviant behavior from something. It's not coming internally. It's not coming out of necessity. It's coming out of learning. We're with a group of people that think it's okay, so we're going to think it's okay. And the bottom line, individuals become deviant when their contact with favorable views towards deviance outweigh their contacts with unfavorable views. So if we're thinking about maybe a middle school kid who's hanging out, who has had the same group of friends for the last 5 or 6 years, we're thinking about middle schoolers thinking about drug use, for example. That friend group is very against it. They don't want to do it. So if you're part of that friend group, you're also more likely to adopt those norms. You're also against drug use, and you fit in with the group that way. But if you have stumble upon a new friend group, and they're drinking, doing drugs, and you're part of that, you're going to want to fit in. According to differential association, that's pretty much all the factors that you need, to exhibit deviant behavior, just because you're part of that group. And the views that those people hold in terms of the deviant behavior is going to be a lot more favorable than the views that the previous group has held. So now, because you're in contact with those favorable views and you're no longer in contact with the unfavorable views, the chance for committing deviant behavior is going to be extremely, extremely high. So another theory, when we talk about deviance, that we can discuss is called labeling theory. And it was created by Howard Becker, and that is him to the left. So differential association has been criticized for its failure to account for an individual's characteristics and experiences and how they affect deviant influences. Differential association, like we just said, puts a lot of emphasis on the environment. So it's basically, we are pretty much just a product of our environment, and our behavior is completely learned from our peers and from our environment. One of the huge criticisms of differential association is that we're humans. We have internal monologue. There are factors internally that affect our decisions and that affect our behavior. So labeling theory accounts for that a little bit more. Like I said, created by Howard Becker. It argues that deviant behavior is the result of society's response to a person rather than that person's inherent self. So when we're talking about labeling, we're talking more so about how society as a whole has an effect, and how these social constructs and labels have effects on our own behavior. So labeling can have effects on the way society views deviance and the way deviants view themselves. And that's the most important part of labeling theory, I would say. So individuals labeled as deviants may be more likely to engage in deviant behavior. And this is, an example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. When we have these stereotypes, and we tell someone that's part of a group that is stereotyped that they're expected to behave in a way, they are much, much more likely to actually behave that way. That's what the self-fulfilling prophecy is. And that's one of the big aspects of Howard Becker's labeling theory, is that when we label these deviants, one, we treat them as deviants as a society, we treat them lesser, we treat them as deviants, and two, they view themselves as deviants, so they are more likely to commit deviant acts in the future. So that accounts a little bit more for the individual and for the environment when we compare it to differential association. And structural strain theory is the third theory that we're going to talk about, and that's Robert Merton to the right. His structural strain theory explains deviance as a consequence of individuals not being able to fulfill their social goals. So if society does not provide the means of achieving a goal in a way that is in line with its norms, individuals will deviate to achieve these goals. So basically what it's saying is that most to all of deviant behavior is a result of necessity. Basically, they're saying it's a result of survival necessity. So remember, we have differential association, where we're basically saying we learn deviant behavior from people around us. We have labeling theory, which says society is responsible for the label, and then that label is how we view ourselves, and it's how we interact with society that has the biggest effect on deviant behavior. So structural strain theory is just basically saying when the structure of the society is not allowing us to fulfill our goals, specifically, like needs, like biological needs. So if we can't get food, if we can't get money, if we have no shelter, no water, structural strain theory is saying that those are the biggest factors that come into play when an individual performs deviant behavior. And that's what we mean when we say society does not provide the means of achieving a goal in a way that is in line with its norms. So basically, if we have someone that's financially disadvantaged and they're trying to put food on the table, but they cannot find a job, they cannot find a job that's well paying, maybe they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to birth control, so they have a lot of children, they have no money. Structural strain theory, in the context of structural strain theory, this person, maybe these two parents in a two-parent household, are trying to achieve a goal, which is survival, financial goals. Even, for example, they're trying to feed their children and they're trying to keep a roof over their head, but the society is not giving them job, it's not giving them the money that will help them accomplish this goal. So what do? They resort to deviant behavior, theft, murder, anything like that. So for example, those in the US who are financially disadvantaged, just like the story I told, from birth have less access to social resources, including education, and will therefore more likely deviate. And that's why we see more deviant behavior in these lower income neighborhoods. So selling drugs or stealing, say. You have to, basically, Robert Merton is saying that we have to find a way to fulfill these goals. So if society is not providing us a way to fulfill these goals, we're going to fulfill them with deviant behavior. So one criticism of structural strain theory is that it does not account for non-utilitarian crimes, so malicious or violent in nature. So humans commit violent crimes all the time for non-utilitarian reasons. Crimes of passion, for example, murder is not always utilitarian. We don't always see humans commit murder, in order for them to survive. There are crimes of passion, there's revenge, we're emotional creatures. So structural strain theory doesn't really explain that kind of deviant behavior. It really only explains it in the context of necessity. So that's one of the huge criticisms of structural strain theory. And it's really important to keep in mind that when you're studying, sociological theories or any of these theories for the soft sciences, there's usually never one all-encompassing theory. There are just a couple of different theories, which it's super important to learn about because there are aspects of truth to each of them. They just don't all tell the whole story. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next topic, a little bit about collective behavior. And even if you haven't learned about that yet, I'm sure you understand what it is just from the name. So norms, mores, and taboos. Norms, mores, taboo, and the other concepts we have previously discussed pertain to behavior of the individual, so conforming versus deviant behaviors. So distinct from group behavior, which is how humans regularly act in a group according to their societal norms, collective behavior is a phenomenon that occurs spontaneously and often violates social norms. So collective behavior is basically transient behavior. It's these sort of things that we see happen when groups of people collect together in the same proximity. It's not group behavior, which is basically just how we normally function in a society from day to day. The stuff that we've been talking about is more so group behavior. Collective behavior is it's transient, so it's meaning it comes and it goes, it's fleeting. It's basically what happens when a group of people get together. There are different things that can happen in different contexts. So that's what collective behavior is. It associates and then it disseminates. And it often does violate societal norms, doesn't always. So mobs and riots are examples of collective behaviors which go against the societal norms. They're usually coming together for a specific purpose. Fads and trends in fashion are examples of collective behavior that are harmless. So they see a steep rise in popularity and then they fall off just as quickly. And I put a picture of scrunchies at the bottom because those were a huge fashion trend in the 90s. They fell off. I do see some revivals for the scrunchie in modern day. But yeah, those are fashion trends that are, considered harmless. So classification of collective behavior. So although classification of collective behavior is debated, many people have different categories. Anytime we're talking about classification or categorization, it's a social construct. It doesn't exist in nature. So if you have 10 different people, they're all going to think that their classification system is the best. In terms of the MCAT, we will look at Herbert Blumer's because he divided collective behavior into 4 categories. So the first one is crowds. And those are groups that form to share a purpose. So crowds may result in a non-permanent loss of rational thinking known as herd behavior. So this is what I was talking about sometimes when people come together in groups, depending on what context they're in. Rational thinking can go out the door. Mobs, like we said, is one of the examples. Mob mentality, I'm sure you've heard of. Crowds may emerge for planned or spontaneous events, going to a concert or waiting in line, for example. If you're going to the store, especially during COVID, and you realize that there's a line outside, you weren't really expecting to wait on the line, but that's sort of a spontaneous group that has formed, and you're a part of that group now, so you are susceptible to collective behavior, any of these collective behaviors, depending on what's happening in that moment. So a mob is an example of an emotionally heightened crowd whose behavior is directed towards a specific and violent goal. Just something to keep in mind. So publics are groups of individuals not necessarily in close proximity that share views on single issues. Those who share the same political ideology, for example, can be considered a public. And these publics can be grouped together, especially in the age of social media. So publics are united on issues. It's more of the ideology. Masses are united. Masses are usually larger and they share similar interests. And they are definitely formed through the use of mass media or the use of social media. So, if you think about Facebook groups, people with common interests, you join a cooking page or something like that. Those are masses. You're sharing similar interests. And then we have social movements, the 4th type of collective behavior. And these have the goal of promoting change. So there are 2 types of social movements. Active movements seek to foster social change. A really quick, abrupt version of an active movement is a revolution. We're directly seeking to foster social change. Expressive movements foster individual change, like a support group, for example. We're working on the individual rather than overhauling society. But they are all examples of collective behavior because they involve a group of humans. Okay. A fad is an example of collective behavior in which something experiences a sudden rise in public interest, is maintained briefly, and then experiences a rapid decline in public interest. Like we talked about the scrunchies, trends are longer lived in contrast and usually lead to social change. Longer lived contrast usually lead to social change. I'm trying to think of an example. I think the book that I was reading used hippies as a trend. There are certain aspects in their culture that made it into mainstream, and they continue to be in mainstream culture. So trends are a little bit more permanent. Fads are super quick, really quick incline, really quick decline. One other important aspect of collective behavior is mass hysteria, or the collective delusion that spreads through emotions until it spirals out of control. In the age of mass media and social media, I think we are all ridiculously conscious of the effect that mass hysteria has on the population. It's very, very concerning, but it really is just part of human nature how, misinformation and heightened emotions and just complete lack of rational thinking can spiral millions and millions and even billions of people into a panic. Okay, so biases, emotion, and cognition in social behavior. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So the first thing I want to talk about is attribution theory. And there are 3 factors that help an individual determine whether another's behavior is due to dispositional or situational reasons. So attribution theory is basically a theory that seeks to explain when we are looking at another individual in society, it's basically our perception of their actions. Why are they doing what they're doing? And basically, there are two reasons. There are two reasons that we can attribute an individual's behavior to in any specific situation. So the first is dispositional factors, which are internal. So say someone does something and we're trying to figure out why they're doing something. The dispositional factors would be their personality traits, their experiences, mostly their personality traits when we're talking about dispositional reasons. So what personality trait led them to do what they did? Situational reasons are environmental and external. So what is going on in their life currently? What's going on in the immediate surroundings that is causing them to act this way? So number one, consistency of a specific behavior may lead one to believe that the person in question is exhibiting behavior attributed to dispositional factors. So what that means is if you know your best friend and you see them acting in a specific way, for years across multiple similar situations, that's probably due to dispositional factors, because the situational factors are going to change throughout the years if they're in different environments. But if they're still acting the same exact way in each environment, it's probably due to dispositional factors, because the only thing that's not changing are those internal factors. So the consistency of something indicates that it's a dispositional factor. Distinctiveness, does the individual act in a certain way only with you or in all similar situations? Distinct behavior from case to case indicates dispositional attribution. So it's similar to consistency. If they're acting a certain way only with you or all in similar situations. Anytime something is similar across different situations, we attribute it to dispositional reasons. Consensus of an emotion or behavior with a large group may indicate situational attribution. So if an individual in the group feels differently than the others, it may indicate dispositional attribution. So if we have a bunch of people in a group and we're all acting the same way, the larger the group, the more the consensus, the stronger the consensus. That is a good indication that it's a situational attribution, because we're all different. We all have different internal reasons for doing whatever we do. But the one thing that unites us is that we're all in the same situation. So if our behavior is the same, there's a good chance that this is a consensus. There's a good chance that it's situational reasons that we're acting the way we're acting. And more so if an individual in that specific group feels differently than the others. So if there are 50 people that are doing one thing and there's one person that's doing another thing, that's going to indicate that that individual, it's probably that individual is acting in that way because of dispositional reasons, because of internal reasons. If they're, whatever the situation that they're in with 50 other people and they're the only one that's doing something else, they're not being affected by the environment. It's more so character traits. And I saw that picture online and I just had to put it on because it's so ridiculous and so funny. So it's just the difference between dispositional and situational attribution in the same situation. So we have a teacher, a girl handed in her assignment to the left. She hands in her assignment late and the teacher thinks, so late, lazy bum. That's dispositional attribution because he is attributing the characteristic of being lazy to the girl, and that is the reason why she handed her assignment in late. Situational attribution, he may say something like, so late, maybe a family issue. So the paper is late, so he's sort of giving the girl the benefit of the doubt, and he's saying, maybe it's a situational reason. It's not just because this little tiny girl is a lazy bum. Maybe she's having family issues. So that's the difference. Same situation, two different viewpoints. So emotion and cognition both play a role in prejudice. And to the right, the limbic system, that is the part of the brain that regulates emotion, among a couple of other things. So since the core of prejudice is often composed of fear and frustration, emotional factors often lead us to exercise prejudice against intimidating or unknown situations or people. And that's sort of just something that's built in to human beings, which we're going to talk about a little bit down there. It's really something that we can't really control. The only way that we try to control it is through self-monitoring and self-awareness, basically. And some people are better than others. And it actually, the ability to, inhibit prejudice thought actually decreases with age, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So scapegoats are people at whom displaced aggression is blamed. Displaced aggression and blame is directed. The Jews during World War II, for example, they were scapegoated for economic ruin, among a couple of other things in Europe during the 20th century. And scapegoating is a really important aspect of like cognitively when we're talking about this stuff, because the fear and the frustration, leads this prejudice that has to come out in a certain way. So we often direct this aggression to scapegoats for a number of reasons. Cognitively, we are primed to experience discomfort or fear when presented with unknown situations, like I said a little bit before. So for example, emotion processing centers, the limbic center, in the brain become more active in a person who is seated on a bus next to an unfamiliar person of another race. So regardless, some people will claim that they are completely not prejudiced. Some people will claim that they are prejudiced. This is just how your brain works. Of any race. If you're sitting next to an unfamiliar person of another race, those emotion processing centers become active. So despite the feeling of guilt someone may have for experiencing these emotions, the prejudice can be controlled through self-monitoring. So we can't really control what our brain does when we're faced with an unfamiliar situation, but we can control how we act. So that is something, that's something that we actively, seek to do, because, we're aware that prejudice is wrong, or we're aware that it's wrong, but we can't really control what our biology does, which is very interesting. The next fact is that self-inhibiting behavior weakens with age, making it harder to inhibit prejudiced thoughts as an individual gets older, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, inhibiting prejudice is definitely a conscious effort that we have to put in. So animal communication and game theory, we're pretty much done. I'm only going to talk really quickly about this. So I put a picture right over here, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, is a honeybee doing a waggle dance. This is just a way that honeybees communicate with each other in terms of food sources, which is also really interesting. So nonverbal communication is any method used by animals to communicate that does not involve spoken word. So we use nonverbal communication even when we speak. Tone, pitch, and volume of speech are all methods of communicating more information than the words that are explicitly spoken. So since other animals are nonverbal, they employ a wider range of nonverbal cues to communicate. So animals are awesome at communicating without words. An animal may display bright colors to alert potential enemies of its toxicity. So for example, we have poison dart frog that I put to the right. It's beautifully colored, but animals that see this in the wild know that those bright colors mean do not eat it, because it is super poisonous. So that is a form of nonverbal communication, and it's an adaptation that this frog uses to survive. So they may also use colors, sounds, and pheromones to communicate their intent to mate. Colors, it depends on the context. Animals understand context just as much as humans do. Sometimes colors are used to indicate toxicity. Sometimes they're used to indicate sexual prowess. So some species may use movement as well. So like we saw before, honeybees do a waggle dance to indicate the location of food sources. And there's been a lot of study on honeybees. It's a little bit out of context of this lecture, but nonverbal communication in animals is really, really interesting. These honeybees use dances to point to their food source, and they adjust their dance based on the distance. So their waggle will be longer if the food is farther. It'll be shorter if the food is closer, and they actually adjust their orientation to point to the food. So there's a lot of complex nonverbal communication that goes on in the animal kingdom that's really interesting. Okay, so social behavior in animals, it usually occurs between members of the same species, but not usually between different species. So 3 basic points of animal social behavior. Attraction between members of the same species holds together friendships, romantic relationships, and other social relationships. So when we say attraction, we're not necessarily just talking about sexual attraction. We're talking about attraction regardless of what type of attraction it is, it's just a force that brings 2 social beings together. So that could be in terms of friendship. There is an attractive aspect in friendships. There's a reason why you are friends with the person you're friends with. It doesn't necessarily have to be romantic or physical attraction, but there is an attractive aspect to it. So the 3 characteristics that foster attraction are proximity, physical attractiveness, and similarity. So proximity is the most important aspect of attraction, because we basically choose our friends based on how close they are. I live in New York, so I am much more likely to be friends with someone in New York than I am to be friends with someone in Russia. It's just, it's just human nature. It's how it works. Physical attractiveness is also important in attraction. And most people would argue physical attractiveness is important in all aspects of life. People who are rated more physically attractive are also rated with better, higher quality characteristics, like internal characteristic or character traits. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just the way our psychology works. And similarity. We like to be around people that are similar to us. That whole opposites attract thing is not usually really true. Similarity really fosters attraction more so than opposition. And again, that's in friendships, romantic relationships, and any other kind of social relationship. Relationships in which people share similar interests tend to last longer. Aggression is another type of animal social behavior. It's a destructive force to social relations. Aggression is often considered a behavior with the intention to cause harm or assert dominance. So it's sort of the opposite of attraction. It destroys social relations. And social support is very important for the health of humans and other animals. Those with more social support live longer and lead healthier lives. So for example, people who have social support have been shown to engage in healthier behaviors, and they live longer lives actually. So social support is super important for animals that live in a social context, including humans. It's actually a part of our health. So it's not something it's not something that you should, shy away from when you're talking about health, or when you're treating patients in the future. You have to make sure that you understand that there's an important social aspect to human health, an important social aspect of physical human health as well, because people who live in social environments compared to people who live in isolation have better health outcomes throughout their entire lives. So biology of social behavior, the inclusive fitness of an organism is defined by the number of offspring, how well the offspring are supported, and how well the offspring support others in a group. So an organism may improve its overall inclusive fitness by engaging in altruism, behaviors that benefit others at the possible expense of the organism. Although the organism may die, it saves the group, many of which are probably close genetic relatives. Because what we really want to pass on is that genetic information. That's the point of evolution. That's the point of survival of the fittest. So if we have a group of squirrels, for example, they're in smaller groups, there's a chance it's probably a family unit. Say we have 5 or 6 squirrels and they come across a predator, one of them will scream, notify the rest of the family. So the other squirrels will be able to get away safe, but there is a very good chance that that squirrel that screamed might not be able to get away. So in the context of the MCAT, we will consider this altruism. It is, however, now, in the context of the MCAT, we will consider this altruism just because that individual animal is sacrificing itself for the better of the rest of the group at the deficit of its own health. The caveat, though, is that it saves the group, many of which are probably close genetic relatives. So by sacrificing itself, it is actually ensuring that the genetic information that it has passed on to the rest of its family is going to be reproduced. And that results in an increase of inclusive fitness. Okay, game theory really quickly. It is, I think at least, it is super low yield on the MCAT. I don't even know if I've ever come across a game theory question when I was studying or even on any tests, but it is on the AAMC website. So I did want to give you guys a really quick just introduction to it. That's really it. John von Neumann is to the left. He's often considered the father of game theory. Evolutionary game theory is often used to try and predict large systems and behaviors. So for example, how altruistic behaviors are possible in the context of natural selection. Because when we think of natural selection, we think of survival of the fittest. There's really no reason why altruistic behavior should be beneficial because it's killing the individual. There are a lot of studies on it. Even some theories that we've discussed, altruistic behaviors, there's some theories posit that there really is no such thing as truly altruistic behavior because this altruistic behavior results in an increase of inclusive fitness. So that would be considered advantageous, and that would actually help the genetic information spread. So can we really consider it altruistic? Maybe, maybe not, a little bit outside the scope of the MCAT. But basically, game theory seeks to create formulae and analyze and predict complex behavior in nature. So the whole point is that we're considering we're trying to basically create a formula and a theory for how groups of specific animals are going to react, or how basically by analyzing how an individual in a group will react. We take those behaviors and then we just, try to analyze these systems and try to predict. And like I said, it's not really high yield on the MCAT, but I did want to mention it because it has a lot of implications in evolutionary biology. Okay, one more question. Which of the following are considered nonverbal communication? Take 1 to 2 minutes, pause the video. I will go over it in just a second. Okay, so which of the following are considered nonverbal communication? The answer is D, 1, 2, and 4. So let's go over the individual Roman numerals. So 1 says a male peacock showing off its colorful tail feathers to a potential mate. That is definitely considered nonverbal communication, not using words, and it's communicating information to a potential mate that it's ready to have offspring. 2, a woman lets out a loud scream after being startled by a mouse in her apartment. That is also nonverbal communication. Remember, humans can use their mouths to communicate non-verbally. If you are not speaking words, it is not considered verbal communication. Even if you are speaking words, there are other non-verbal cues that we use to communicate more information than just the spoken word. So we have tone, pitch, the volume of our voice, facial expressions. We're using this in tandem with verbal communication to communicate more information at the same time. But a scream alone, without any actual words, is considered nonverbal communication. 3, a doctor tells his patient he must cut sodium out of his diet. From that alone, we're just seeing verbal communication. He is telling his patient what he needs to do. So 3 would not be correct. And 4, a friend sends you a picture of a thumbs up emoji to indicate her agreement. That is also nonverbal communication because it's not, we're not using words, we're using symbols to communicate a message. So it's not verbal, it's not a word, so it's not considered verbal communication. So 1, 2, and 4 are correct, so D would be the correct answer. If you have any questions on that, again, send me an email. That's it for today. We finished our content. Yeah, that's really it. If you want to be added to the group me, if you want to set up some office hours, any questions, comments, insults, shoot me an email. Other than that, have a great time studying, and I will see you guys next week.